Hi, welcome to Bible Interpretation Hebrew Scriptures Module 8. I hope that you had a great week as we come into now this final module and wind down our class together. I know metaphysical Bible interpretation is certainly daunting when we first come into it. There's a lot of material that we've had to cover, a lot of ways that you can approach the material, as well as varying levels of understanding in terms of how we do metaphysical interpretation. I hope the guidelines you've received over the course of time that we've been together have been helpful and will also be an encouragement to you to continue in your practice of Bible interpretation. Just relax and kind of lean into it. This week, we're looking once again at a great prophet, Ezekiel. We're only working with chapter 1, where he receives the vision that gives him his prophetic calling. There are a lot of symbols, imagery in this first chapter that can take quite a bit of time to be able to break down and really come up with a meaningful interpretation. I've given you a handout from Elizabeth Sand Turner's book, Let There Be Light, where I simply excerpted the pieces related to Ezekiel. She doesn't cover the chapter in depth, but she does talk about Ezekiel as a whole and the book as a whole that can help give some frame of reference in terms of looking at him and creating a metaphysical interpretation out of the chapter that we're going to work with, chapter 1. By way of context, Ezekiel is a prophet who came up through a specific tradition of priests in Judaism. He is a Zadokite, which were the high priests, if you will. And so they were kind of like the upper echelon of the priesthood in Israel. He comes out of a tradition which saw the Israelites as being distinct and held aside as God's people. He's writing during the time of the exile, and he's also writing, unlike many of the other voices in the Hebrew Bible, which were writing for their contemporary audience. He actually is writing for people coming down the road, for future readers. Even in the redaction of the book, this premise has been retained that he was writing for people coming down the pike. He's writing during the exile, bearing in mind in his cosmology and his viewpoint, the Israelites and Israel are the chosen people. Now they're in the situation during the exile. They've been dispersed. How can you still be God's chosen people if this is happening to you and if this dispersion this occurred, the diaspora, has occurred? So he lays this premise in chapter 1 of a vision of God and God as transcendent as well as God as immanent. We're working with the vision of God as transcendent, and I want to encourage you to hold that in your awareness while you are deciphering the different symbols. And so he puts forth this great vision of God that's quite complex and has several moving pieces. So I would encourage you that as you're working with it, you're looking at the symbolism of where God comes from. He sees a stormy wind, for example, out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness just dancing through, a couple of the verses in here. And then he talks about 4, so we have the motif of 4 showing up, 4 living creatures. He describes what those creatures look like. He describes the chariot that God is sitting in, the throne. There's references to what we see in Genesis of God being above the dome. So there's above the dome and below the dome. So below the dome where people reside and above the dome where God is. So that's part, again, of God is transcendent. As you're working with it, what does this scripture, this chapter, tell you about the characteristics and some of the nature of God as transcendent? That would be the question I would put forth as you're working with the metaphysical interpretation and looking at the symbols, looking at the signs, and deciding for yourself, where does this motif fit in for you in your understanding of and your experience of God, of the divine? I'm not going to really say much more than that about the scripture itself, because I do want you to be challenged by it, just as I am challenged by it, and to work with it for yourself. So I'm going to stop with this portion of my comments about the metaphysical interpretation, and encourage you again to pull out your MBD, your Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, to look up the meaning of Ezekiel's name, to have your revealing word handy in order to choose those aspects of the chapter that you most want to work with. You may decide that you want to excerpt out a certain piece of it that really speaks to you, so that you can take a look through the revealing word and see what some of the metaphysics are behind the different symbols that you've chosen, and putting it all together for yourself. What does this vision, okay, what is this vision of God? How does it speak to you? And like I said, relate to your experience of God as being expressed through Ezekiel. And about fulfilling, the promise in God being in our lives during very difficult and challenging times, or the awareness of the presence of God in our lives during challenging times. Okay, so pause on that piece. As this is our final module, and I said in my comments coming in, I hope that over the course of the time we've been together, you come to a place of being inspired, intrigued, and wanting to continue with working with Bible interpretation. I know for myself, I've come to love it. It's one part of what I appreciate so much about Unity, and what Charles and Myrtle brought to the world in terms of how we can relate with the Bible as the expression of consciousness. I want to turn now specifically to the reflection paper, your theme paper, to conclude the assignments for you for this course. And so coming back now, which in page 3 of the syllabus, of choosing one of 4 topics to write your theme paper. So you can choose a main character from the Hebrew Scriptures. You can choose one of the allegories or something out of the Exodus epic, one of the stories out of the Exodus epic, which is very epic. You can choose the 10 Commandments, or you can choose the vision of one of the great prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures. So you might decide that you want to work more thoroughly, fully with Ezekiel, for example. In each case, there are a set of instructions which go along with each of these topics, okay, to break down. So if you choose a main character from the Hebrew Scriptures, to look at their metaphysical meaning and the metaphysical meaning of their life and life accomplishments. And then looking at the next column over, how has this been an inspiration in your life? Okay, so if you choose a main character, looking at what they represent metaphysically, their accomplishments, and how they can have inspired your life. If you choose an allegory or a story from Exodus, looking at the metaphysical meaning of the characters in the story, and what does it say about your own spiritual evolution? Okay, so how are you applying this into your life? If you decide to look at the 10 Commandments, what each of those commandments metaphysically represents for you, and how does it serve as a guide, again, the application, how does it serve as a guide for you in your personal practices and in the actions that you take in your life? And then lastly, in terms of one of the great prophets, what does that prophet metaphysically represent? What's the metaphysical meaning of their vision? And how would that apply to your life or to the world today? One of the primary considerations about Bible interpretation is this aspect of practical application. How can we take what's written between these 2 covers so many thousands of years ago when we're working with the Hebrew Scriptures, so many thousands of years ago especially, and find meaning and find application for it in our lives today. And that's what I believe is part of the beauty in the metaphysical interpretation and the mystical awareness of the biblical writings, is that it makes it, we can pull it out of its historical lock. We can unlock it with the metaphysics and the mysticism, and we can pull it out of its historic jail, if you will, or capture, and let it fly free in looking at meaning for us for today. Certainly, as we've talked about throughout the modules of this course, we want to have an awareness of context, because it is an important part of how we go about the interpretation and working with the scripture. But context doesn't have to be limiting or capture it, so we can free it with the metaphysical and mystical interpretation. Each of the segments we've covered in the Hebrew Scriptures do speak to some aspect of the evolution of consciousness, how we are perceiving God. For I join with Marcus Borg, who's used as a foundation text in the overview courses. I agree with Marcus Borg that what we see in the Bible is humankind writing about its understanding of God rather than God writing about its understanding of us. Okay, so we are seeing God through our eyes, and the experience of God through our eyes, and through the consciousness and worldview of the people at the time the writings were were captured, okay, the oral tradition and then put into writing. And certainly that is a part of what we need to hold in our awareness as we work with it. So don't harsh them too judgely, or harshly too judgely. Don't judge them too harshly, okay? We're all a product of where we are, who we are, and the circumstances of our lives. But again, as working through these Hebrew Scriptures, there's so much richness in the writings that can influence and can have applicability to our lives today. I'm just, fondling my Bible and touching some of the pages, and really just even in touching them, they convey an aliveness for me. So I do hope that in the course of this this class that you are inspired, as I said, and will continue with metaphysical interpretation, even as you simplify perhaps some of how you approach it, but to use the tools that are available to you as you gain in your own proficiency and in your own ability to take scripture to heart and let it come alive inside of you. I've enjoyed being with you over the course of these 8 weeks. I look forward to seeing your responses on the discussion board, as well as reviewing your responses to the wisdom quiz. And I trust that our paths will cross again, whether in another course or perhaps at one of the conferences where we'll actually get to meet and spend some time together face to face. As always, feel free to email if you have a question or something you'd like to explore more. I want to be available to you as much as possible. And so thank you for blessing me with being able to be with you in your journey of awakening. And so be well and know that my prayers and love are with you. Namaste.